Mr. Dan
Hello?
Jurgens?
Yes,
Hi. How's everything?
just fine. How about you?
I cannot complain. I have been trying to track you down for a very long time. I'm glad to finally get to speak with you.
Certainly, my pleasure.
First off the bat, you're mostly well known for being one of the prominent Superman writers during the modern era. And after some, let's call it a hiatus, you're now back on Superman. Can you tell us a little bit about that process, how that came to be?
Oh boy. Well, let's see. The best way to phrase it is, yes, there had been something of a hiatus, I suppose, but at the same time, I have recently been writing a miniseries called Superman, Lois and Clark. And in that miniseries, what we did was brought back Superman, the Superman from the pre-Flashpoint DC universe, along with Lois, who he is married to. And I had first brought them back in a two-part Convergence story that came out last year, in which Lois gave birth to their son John. And in Superman, Lois and Clark, we pick up on their story here on the current DC universe, on the current DC Earth, and find out they've been actually living here for several years now, where Superman has been acting in secret behind the scenes, doing the things that only he can do. So, with that in mind, that is something that I think was received generally pretty well. And along with some of the other things that were happening with Superman, that when DC decided to do the rebirth thing and kind of, to a certain extent, get back to perhaps the sensibility that makes some of these characters work, they offered me Action Comics, and I was, more than happy to jump in.
Great. So, can you tell us a little bit about what prompted the decision to bring back the previous Superman, if you will, as opposed, since we had the New 52 Superman, who was, pretty much front and center. But what prompted them to bring him back, give him his own series?
Well, yeah, in a way, I think that's more a question for them than it is for me. I know that um, when we were working on the you know Future's End led to Convergence, and I was one of the writers on Future's End. And as we sort of pitched this idea to Dan of Lois having a baby, I always said that once we did that, that there would be plenty of room for future stories. That if you're going to introduce a child for Lois and Clark into the DC universe, and by DC universe I mean all of DC, right? Um, that what that becomes is potential, and it becomes something for tomorrow and something that can mean something down the road. And ultimately, that led to this concept of Superman, Lois, and Clark, and the idea that when Convergence came to an end, that they could find their way to this present Earth. And I think in part it works because so many people still remember that Superman, his past, and the fact that he's married to Lois, that became a very strong part of who he is and what that character is.
One of the things that I've noted with the series, I followed it from Convergence right into Lois and Clark, so I never missed a beat. When I looked at the sales on the series, I was pretty surprised at the numbers, and so I actually spoke with some people and asked, why weren't they buying it? And a lot of people didn't seem to realize that it was the same Superman from previous. They thought it was something Convergence related. To be honest, there was a lot of confusion. So, is there going to be anything to kind of streamline readers so they understand that this is the Superman from the previous universe? This isn't a mock-up or anything of that nature?
Yeah, I think that by the time we get to Rebirth and those books start coming out, and you see some of what happens in the current Superman titles, beyond Superman, Lois, and Clark, that I think that delineation will really be made clear. And right now, Peter Tomasi is writing a lot of that material, and it's really terrific stuff. And what he's done is sort of taken what we've set up and is starting to integrate, that Superman into the DC universe a little bit, and is doing a story where the two Supermen are going to meet. So I think as we go forward, that will become more and more clear.
Okay, great. Now, having worked on one of the, again, you worked with a really great team. To be honest, it's right up there with the Swanderson team and the great Bronze Age team that was writing Superman at that time. And a lot of readers still remember that. Can we look forward to something like that with the book since you're going to be on and they're trying to make things more cohesive rather than what we saw earlier with the New 52 where it seemed like all the books were set in their own separate worlds?
Oh yeah, I think so. I mean, um, I know certainly that on the other Superman title, with what Pete Tomasi and Pat Gleason are doing, because they're co-writing the book, that we have certainly talked and said, well, we aren't necessarily going to continue from issue to issue across the series, sort of like we did back in the day with the triangle numbers. What we wanted to make sure of is that our worlds reflect each other and that our stories reflect consistent characterization for these people. So they might be telling, one story with Superman. I'll be telling another story. But if you look at the supporting cast, the way that these characters exist, their intent and purpose, I think it's all going to be very tight and reflective of it being the same character.
Now, I did a little reading with the current Superman issue where the New 52 Superman is saying that he's dying, and the uh, pre-Flashpoint Superman is now prominent in all of the books. Will you be dealing with the New 52 Superman at all during your run with the new series as they come out, with the Rebirth series rather?
My focus really is going to be on the same Superman and Lois that I've been handling in Superman, Lois and Clark. That's kind of what I built all this story material on. They're the core of it, and that's really who I'm going to be focusing on.
I'm a long time reader. I've been reading for, without dating myself, I've been reading for a very long time. And my introduction to Superman was with Crisis. And as a kid reading, I was very daunted by reading Superman because it was up to issue 400, and I was like, oh Lord, how will I ever catch up? So I never read it. But they gave an issue one, and I was able to read. And I stopped reading after a certain point because I wasn't very interested, even though I thought the John Byrne's art was excellent. The stories just didn't grab me. Then there was a storyline for Panic in the Sky, and that really brought me into Superman's world because it established for me who he was in the DC universe. He was a leader. He was a person who all the other heroes looked to. He inspired everybody, and even if he wasn't necessarily front and center with all of the action, you could feel his influence in just about everything that was going on. With the stories that we're going to be looking at now with the Rebirth, is there going to be a return to that sort of stance for Superman, where he is a leader, he's an inspirational figure, he has an idea of he has a set idea of who he is and what he wants to do, and we can get to see people react to that type of characterization from him.
Yes, and part of that is because let's address this in kind of two phases. One is that when we did Panic in the Sky, I know one of the things that always used to bug me is alien invasion coming to Earth, aliens show up, wipe out, a couple of cities, and only then do the heroes respond. And I always said that, gee, given the technology these heroes have, et cetera, they should know it's coming. And instead of waiting for it to happen and be a disaster, and then get all the heroes together, that just once I'd like to see someone take charge, take command, and go out in space to meet the threat head on kind of thing. And so I think Panic in the Sky was a very important story for us to do and a very important statement to make in regards to Superman and his standing within the superhero pantheon of the DCU. I think now it's much more the same way. This Superman, as he finds himself on this planet now, is older and I think even more self-assured than that one was. I think this is a Superman who has been through the wars, so to speak. I think in his head he knows what works and what doesn't. And given all that, I don't think he's standing around waiting for someone else to suggest an idea of what they should do to solve a problem. To him, it's second nature to just say, there's the problem, here's how we fix it. And I never see him as the guy who says, look, I'm the boss, I'm in charge, because frankly, the minute you do that, I think you lose anyone who follows you anyway. He leads by example. He leads by who he is. He has this sense of authority to him and this sense of integrity to him that I think makes others want to follow him.
Now, looking at the basic setup, Superman, Lois, it's really just Superman and Lois. These are the only survivors, at least for now, from the previous universe. How does that juxtapose with this new universe as they understand the world as it can be as opposed to the world that it is? The world that they're coming from, I believe, was a place that was a bit brighter, a bit more hopeful, and the New 52 universe is a bit more rough around the edges. So, how much does that play into the storytelling?
I think that's always going to be a part of it. And certainly I've had those characters make that observation several times in Superman, Lois, and Clark, that even though they've been there now for several years, they're acutely aware that this is not the world that they were accustomed to, that it is a world with differences, that it is a more cynical place, that it is a more sharp place, if you will, that there are, you know, many more shades of gray to it, I suppose, than the world they came from. So I think that's always going to be a bit of a backdrop. At the same time, I don't want that to be like this continuing theme that we're constantly hammering at. I think it has to be a little different than that, because ultimately, I think the other part of that series, and you'll see this by the time we get to the end, is this basic idea that home is where the heart is. And their hearts are with each other. They're a family unit. It's Lois, Clark, and John. And it really is, as long as they're together, it's home. And then they make the best of it. And the more time they spend in this world, the more comfortable it should be.
A friend of mine notes that your characterization of Superman, he feels that your characterization is excellent. This is his question. He feels that your characterization is excellent, but one of the things he always wanted more from in terms of your stories with Superman are those really off the wall feats of using powers in these really phenomenal, out of the world ways. Can we expect to see anything like that?
I'd like to do more of that. I think that part of it is, you run into that. There's sort of this line that exists, and it's always an elusive line and tough to find, that I I have tried to do some of that in the past, and it's like as soon as you do, you start to get into areas that almost feel like it trips into Silver Age silliness at times. And so I don't disagree that it'd be nice to have more of that. Yet when I have done some of that in the past, I kind of get that, oh, that's such a Silver Age type of story kind of comment. So I think the idea is to always find that balance. But I agree wholeheartedly. Certainly, Superman is more than super strength, flying powers, and heat vision.
Now, without a doubt, I'm pretty certain your seminal work on Superman is the death of Superman storyline. And that was well received, but it was also a singular event because it hadn't happened before. But since then, I have to admit, Superman dying or killing him is something that's happened with greater frequency as the years have gone on. I think I looked over the last, since the New 52 came in, and there's been an instance of Superman dying at least once a year, even in media outside of the comics. So, how do you feel about the legacy of that story that you worked on with that great team? Today, 2016.
Well, I'd say a couple of things about it. One is that we should know that there had been death of Superman stories done before we ever did ours, and in part were somewhat the inspiration for what we did. So I think we should always note that it was something that had been done before we got there, more in the imaginary story sense, but it had been done. I look back at it and I think that the real success of the story was taking all three parts together. The death of Superman, um, World Without Superman, or Funeral for a Friend, which was sort of the middle chapter in which we deal with the idea of how the world reacts to not having a Superman. And then the third part of it, which was, the return, where we had four different characters claiming to be Superman. And I think over that period of time, when those stories came out, we built Superman to a level of tremendous popularity. The sales were astounding, and I think that readers were truly hooked on it. That we provided a very fun, durable, long-lasting story that by the time we got back to the point of bringing in four guys claiming to be Superman, also intrigued the hell out of them. I mean, the comment I always make is that if we go back to that point, which was 1990, late 92 and early 93, the internet was somewhat in its formative era. And I'd still see comments then, and I'd hear people say, well, I know how they're bringing him back. I've got an inside connection or whatever. Or, I know how they do it. I know a guy who knows a guy. And the fact is, we really didn't even know ourselves exactly how we were going to bring Superman back. And I think when we finally showed up and had four characters claiming to be Superman, that it offered a tremendous surprise, that no one saw that coming. When you deal with a character like Superman, getting to the point where you have, you know, an incredibly large number of people picking up that book and reading it, and you manage to surprise all of them, that's really hard to do. And what they also never saw coming was the idea that one of them would end up being Evil, the villain of the piece, the cyborg Superman. So, all in all, I look back on it. I think the storyline itself is iconic. I think it always will be. I think the recent film bore some of that out, and I still think it holds up really well yet today. And one of the most gratifying aspects of it all is I do not do a personal appearance, be it a store signing or a convention, where I don't have one, at least one, and usually more people come up to me and say, that's what got me into comics. That's when I started reading comics because I heard about this Death of Superman thing. So I'd like to think it had, a large positive impact overall.
Now, I'm also a fan of Booster Gold, and this is a little bit off, but can we expect any interaction between Booster Gold and Superman? As that's the only really time I get to see him travel through time anymore.
Sure, I would certainly like to do that, in part because if I look at the scope of stories that both Superman and Booster need, I think it's always a natural for Superman and Booster to get together, and I did certainly some of that when I was on the book some time ago, and I just think they fit very well together. In part because, let's face it, Superman tends to be, he's not the guy who's always out there cracking jokes. Booster is, so I think when they're together, there's a nice little buddy thing that happens there where they play off one another fairly well.
So now Superman has a son, and I'm I haven't seen it confirmed in writing, but I'm going to say that his son is probably going to be called Superboy, if not something else, and he'll have his own series in the Super Sons with, I believe, Damian Wayne. Is there going to be more of a thrust to build the Superman family? With New 52, we saw that Superman was pretty much estranged from Kara Zor-El, Supergirl, and he had some interaction with Superboy, but there wasn't really the type of tight knit family structure that we saw with the previous universe. But can we expect to see more of that happening, especially since now that he's a dad?
Yeah, I think that one of the things that should be noted is we've certainly sat in a room together, myself, Pete Tomasi, and Steve Orlando, who's writing Supergirl, Phil Jimenez, who's writing Superwoman, and talked about the idea that there's a place for all these characters to fit together and coexist. And so I think that's very important, especially for Superman and Supergirl, that I think even though these two might not be directly related in the sense that for now, they're from different universes. But I think that the sensibility would still be there, especially on the part of Clark, who would see her as a relative and as his younger cousin.
So now, I just want to talk a little bit about John Kent, which of course is Superman's son. What's your approach to a child superhero? As this is something that, ironically, these characters are created for children, even if they're not necessarily limited to children these days. But we had child superheroes such as Robin, Bucky, Superboy, those type of heroes, and they've all been phased out with the exception of maybe Damian Wayne. So what's your approach going to be for John and Superboy?
Well, I think that's kind of a stay tuned type of answer. Unfortunately, I can't at this point go way down the road on what's going to happen with him and how he's going to develop. What I can do, though, is say, if you look at what we've done so far in Superman, Lois, and Clark, obviously we've seen a young kid who had no idea who his parents were, in that to him, Clark and Lois pretty much worked on someone's farm, and they lived there and had a fairly simple lifestyle. And he's obviously come to suspect that they are much more than that, that perhaps his father is Superman and all this other stuff. So his character, if you will, is very much sort of in that embryonic stage, and we're going to continue to develop that. I think if you look at Damian Wayne, obviously, he's now this fully realized real character that I think has been a tremendous addition to the DC universe. And obviously, in our wildest dreams and our best hopes, that's certainly the path that lies in front of John.
Sorry. You did a series, I'm sorry, you did a story where you had Thor fighting Gladiator, and in that sequence we had a resolution. So since Gladiator is he's more of a Superman analog, is that how you see a Superman versus Thor fight?
Well, that's how I saw the fight as long as I was writing Thor. I do see differences between the Gladiator and Thor. And one of the questions I am most often asked is, could Superman pick up Thor's hammer? And I certainly know that I have an answer to that. And so I think if it was really a Thor-Superman team-up, that would be a lot of fun to do at some point, and certainly something worth exploring.
I've seen, well, again, you guys were on the Superman books for some time, and in the yesteryears, I mean, there were great runs. There was one that was on Superman. Peter David comes to mind, a 12-year run on The Incredible Hulk. Not so much these days. If somebody's on the books for a long period of time, that's almost become something that's astonishing. The runs don't particularly last. But not only did you have this long run on Superman, but you're coming back. And a lot of writers, I've heard them say they really don't have anything else to say about the character, that, their best work is there. But you don't seem to have any impetus in dealing with Superman, and you seem to just have more to say about him. What is it about Superman that seems to resonate with you as a writer?
Oh, I think there are a couple of things, and I think a lot of it is that for Superman, if you look at him, that there is something about that character that just is tremendously appealing, and I find him to be a really elastic character. I mean, some of my favorite stories that I ever did are the smaller one-issue stories. Like we called it Metropolis Mailbag, where on Christmas, Superman would go to the post office and read all these letters that were just sent to Superman in general care of Metropolis, and try and solve the small problems that way. And I think the magic of Superman is that as powerful as he is, that shows how big that story can be. But at the same time, because of the way he was raised, which was, on a farm in Smallville, Kansas, he has this respect for life at all levels that I think allow us to take him into real small stories as well. And I think that's what really works for the character. I also think that, to get back to your earlier point, you're absolutely right about long runs on characters. We're seeing a couple right now. I think, I don't know how many issues he's written, but obviously we've seen Dan Slott on Spider-Man for a good long time. And he's written a number of issues because they had more frequent publishing schedule as well. The other one that comes to mind right now is Scott Snyder and Greg Capullo coming off Batman for DC, which is, I think they did, by the time it's going to be said and done, I think they've done 52 issues. Well, that these days, that's like 100 issue was when I was working, 20, 25 years ago. So I think there are certain creators who kind of tie into characters somehow and find that their voices are in sync and something just works. And when that happens, it's great. And I certainly hope to be able to make that work.
Well, we see that Superman, he's had the most iconic outfit in comic books, in my opinion. And we've seen that change. He's had a new outfit every year for the last 5 years. And he has another one as we come over here. For those people who are fans of what we were going to call now the classic outfit, can we expect to see that make a reappearance anytime?
Not exactly as you might expect, but, obviously you see now that he's wearing something of a different uniform. And what we're going to be having in the books, certainly moving forward, is something that is a little more tied into what we think of him, or think of him wearing as a classic uniform without the, like sculpted lines in it and everything else. That it's going to be pretty close to what he had.
Now, there are a lot of readers who, you know, just to say it frankly, weren't happy with the New 52 reboot, and they decided to vote with their dollars. They're not necessarily buying DC any longer. However, I've been a very big proponent of Superman, Lois, and Clark, and I'm trying to get more people on board to really have a look at it. So for those people who may be just a little bit, standoffish or a little bit dubious about it, what can you tell them to, really come on, give the book a fair go, and have a good taste of what you have to offer?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. One, it's weird because I think to a certain extent, people might look at it and say that it evokes too much of the past. I would say no, quite the contrary. Superman, Lois, and Clark was a harbinger of the future. I mean, this is the series that was brought in the Superman that you're going to be reading about for the most part down the road. That this guy is tomorrow. John is tomorrow. That's what's coming in the DC universe. And I think the idea is that we can find a way to put sort of this new twist on it and find something new to say about these characters. And if we start to look at Superman, Lois, and John as a family unit, I believe that becomes very possible. And at the same time, Lee Weeks is drawing the book, and it's absolutely beautiful. I mean, Lee is a phenomenal storyteller. He's a remarkable draftsman, very talented, and he has invested every bit of himself into these characters as much as I have. And by the time it's all said and done, I think what you're going to see is, through those 8 issues, this emergence of Jonathan Kent, and Jonathan Kent is going to be an important presence in the DC universe going forward.
Now, on the horizon, we have Action Comics 1000. Can you give us any sort of presage for that issue?
No, I can't. That's still, for me, all reality is that's still 43 issues away. We have Action 957 coming out in June. Action 1000 is still, down the road, a couple of years from now. But as I look at it, I think it's absolutely fantastic that DC has gone back to that numbering system. I always regretted that when they moved away from that for both that and Detective. I really think that because of the meaning of Action Comics to this industry, with Action #1 being where Superman first showed up, Action 1000 is like this shining light in the future that we want to build to. I kind of refer to it as the Super Bowl of comics, and I really believe that. Can I also add one other thing?
Sure.
Earlier you had talked about having a difficulty with some issues with some series because they had high issue numbers. It'd be like, Superman 212 or whatever.
Yeah.
When I was a kid reading comics, I always thought the comics with the higher issue numbers meant they were better. So, if I was a kid and I bought Superman number 189, or, Adventure Comics number, 354 was out there, something like that. My assumption was that because they had been around for so long, that meant they were better because they had, withstood the test of time. And that was this natural assumption I made as a kid and as a reader for years. And it wasn't until later that I thought there could possibly be, any kind of other theory. And so I hope we get back to some aspect of that to me, it's a shame that we always have to restart and rejigger and reconfigure the numbering systems and everything else. That I think there's something pure about having series that reach 400, 500, 700, 900, whatever. And I kind of hope that as an industry, we can embrace that again.
Yeah, I'm in total agreement with you on that. I look forward to Action Comics 1000 just as much as anybody else who's a longtime reader like myself. Dan Jurgens, it's been a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you very much for your time. Anything else you'd like to say?
No, it's been my pleasure, TA. Always fun.
Okay, thank you very, very much. Hope to speak with you again.
Sounds good.